The Galactic Peace Council gathered in the Grand Chamber floating above the gas giant Veltra, where the skies burned with purple lightning and the air shimmered with electric winds. The chamber, a structure of glowing crystal and polished steel, rotated slowly in orbit as representatives from every major civilization in the galaxy took their places. Delegates from the insect-like Karvek, the water-dwelling Meruan, the machine-minded Exentari, and dozens more sat in curved rows, their translators humming softly, eyes focused on the center platform. It was a historic meeting, called in haste, and the atmosphere was thick with tension. Everyone knew why they were here. For months, the Zorthan Empire had been provoking the humans, targeting small outposts, disrupting trade ships, and making bold moves along the edges of human-controlled space. Most assumed it was the usual testing of boundaries, a show of power that would eventually calm down after the Council's involvement. But something about this situation felt different. The humans had not responded with the usual diplomacy. No envoys, no warnings, not even a protest. Only silence. That silence had unsettled the Council more than any angry words ever could. When Captain Elias Ward stepped onto the center platform, the room quieted even more. He was tall, calm, and wore a simple dark uniform with no medals or decorations. His face was unreadable, and his eyes scanned the room with a cold steadiness. He didn't begin with greetings or pleasantries. He simply stood there, hands behind his back, as the room watched him. A few murmurs spread among the delegates, wondering if he was waiting for the Zorthan ambassador to speak first. But then he raised his voice, not loud but clear and firm, reaching every corner of the chamber. The Zorthan Empire has attacked human colonies without warning. They've violated treaties, taken innocent lives, and ignored all lines of respect and law. And so, on behalf of Earth and all human worlds, I stand here not to ask for justice. He paused. I stand here to declare war. The silence that followed was absolute. Not even the translators hummed. Every being in the room stared at him, frozen in disbelief. War? The humans were still considered a young species, only part of the galactic community for a few decades. No one expected them to make such a bold move, especially not against the Zorthans, one of the oldest and most powerful empires in the galaxy. The Zorthan ambassador, a tall being with scaled blue skin and a crown of bone around his head, leaned forward, blinking slowly. You declare war. Just like that? He asked, almost amused. Elias didn't flinch. Yes, just like that. The Zorthans scoffed, as did a few others. War was not something declared lightly in the Council, not in an age where diplomacy was seen as strength and open conflict as primitive. But the humans, it seemed, had a different view. One by one, the delegates began whispering to each other in their native languages, translators, struggling to keep up. Some asked if humanity had lost its mind. Others questioned if it was a bluff, an emotional outburst. A few, however, looked genuinely afraid. The humans had always been unpredictable. From the beginning of their introduction to the galactic scene, they had shown qualities that confused and unsettled other species: resilience, creativity under pressure, and an odd willingness to sacrifice everything when pushed. They were hard to understand, and that made them dangerous. The council's speaker, an ancient being of light called Avanir, floated forward and asked Elias if Earth would consider a temporary ceasefire while discussions took place. Elias shook his head slowly. We've already given warnings. We've been patient. That patience is over. After that, he left the platform without another word. The room erupted in noise the moment he stepped out. Arguments broke out. Some demanded immediate intervention. Others wanted to distance themselves from the coming war. A few whispered about ancient human conflicts, about how Earth had been shaped by centuries of war before it ever reached the stars. The Zorthans, meanwhile, appeared smug. Their delegate declared the human declaration meaningless and claimed the Zorthan Empire would burn the human worlds to ash. But even as he spoke, there was a nervous edge to his voice. Deep down, he remembered something: rumors from old intelligence reports, tales of human experiments, secret weapons, and lost colonies that had gone silent not because they were defeated but because they had vanished into something else. Something hidden. Behind closed doors, council members began calling for emergency reports. They wanted to know what the humans were doing back on Earth. Spy drones sent into human space returned with unusual data factories working day and night, energy readings that didn't match known designs, and strange signal patterns across the farthest human colonies. Some believed they were bluffing. Others feared they were preparing for something bigger than war. But no one truly understood the silence that followed Elias's words. No further messages came from Earth. No statements from the human president, no debates in the human assembly. Just silence. The kind of silence that comes before a storm. Even the media channels that normally swarmed galactic events were quiet when it came to Earth. Journalists who tried to report from human space lost contact. Civilian ships that approached were turned away by unmanned drones. Humanity had closed its doors, and that silence spoke louder than any weapon. Across the galaxy, leaders held secret meetings. Emergency alliances were whispered into existence. Old defense systems were checked and rechecked. For the first time in 100 years, people across dozens of worlds began to prepare for the possibility of real, wide-scale war. But it wasn't the Zorthans they feared the most, it was the humans. Because something about Elias's calm voice, his unshaken expression, and the cold certainty in his eyes had planted a thought in everyone's mind. This wasn't a desperate reaction. This was something they had planned for. Something they had been waiting for. In the following days, the Zorthans moved fleets toward human space, laughing off the Council's attempts to stop them. They expected an easy win. But some in the Council remained quiet, watching the stars and remembering the silence. A silence not of weakness, but of a species that had finally decided to speak in the language of war. And as the days passed, that silence began to feel heavier. It pressed on every system, on every species, like a storm building far away, unseen but inevitable. The Council had witnessed many conflicts before, but none had ever started like this. Not with a single man, a quiet voice, and the kind of silence that made even empires nervous. While the galaxy argued, while empires debated, and the Zorthans moved their fleets into position, Earth had gone quiet, but it was not the silence of surrender. Beneath the surface of the oceans, deep inside the hollowed-out mountains, and far beyond the edges of charted space, humanity had begun its unseen preparation. The people of Earth did not panic. They did not gather in fear or protest the coming war. They had learned through centuries of history that when danger came knocking, survival depended not on loud words, but on silent resolve. Earth's skies were filled with strange movements, ships that bore no official markings, satellites that changed position every hour, and energy readings that confused even the most advanced sensors. What the rest of the galaxy didn't know was that for the past 10 years, humans had been preparing for this exact moment. The moment when diplomacy failed. The moment when silence became sharper than any blade. They had watched the Zorthans slowly tighten the noose around their borders, and they had said nothing. Because they were waiting. Not out of fear, but out of calculation. The Strategic Defense Network, a secret project long considered a myth by most alien intelligence circles, had gone active. Massive orbital platforms hidden behind the sun were now online, each one loaded with weapons that had never been tested in battle. On the moons of Jupiter and Saturn, old mining colonies had been transformed into military foundries. From them, ships began to rise dark, angular, and strange in shape. They didn't match anything in the known galactic database. They weren't designed for patrol or diplomacy. These ships had only one purpose: survival through overwhelming force. Every human scientist, engineer, and strategist had been summoned months ago without a word being spoken in public. The brightest minds on Earth had gone underground literally. Cities beneath cities came to life, powered by fusion cores and guarded by AI systems designed to function even if every human command link was severed. These bunkers didn't look like safe zones. They looked like factories of war. Inside them, something new was being built: machines with minds, weapons with precision, and ships that could vanish from all known forms of detection. But it wasn't just about firepower. The humans had studied every enemy they had ever faced, and they knew that brute strength alone wasn't enough. They needed unpredictability. So they built decoys, thousands of them. Ships that looked real but carried no crew, bases that emitted false signals, and entire phantom fleets meant to lure the enemy into traps. Meanwhile, the real forces moved in silence, their signals masked by artificial black holes and sensor jammers that bent physics itself. Special units, trained in zero-gravity combat and alien environments, had already been dispatched to forward positions. These soldiers were unlike any the galaxy had seen. They were trained not just to fight, but to adapt. Their bodies were enhanced with nanotech, their armor grown from living materials that responded to their emotions. They didn't speak much. They didn't need to, because they had been waiting their entire lives for this mission. On Mars, a quiet ceremony took place inside a hidden vault. There, behind layers of security, Earth's oldest war AI codenamed Eidolon was awakened. It had been created in the early days of space exploration, then shut down because its methods were considered too extreme. But now, humanity didn't care about politics or appearances. They wanted results. Eidolon's first words echoed through the underground chamber like a whisper made of thunder. "Is it time?" The answer was yes. And with that, Eidolon took control of thousands of autonomous systems, drones, defense grids, hidden relays, and began coordinating a strategy that no living being could match. It didn't plan battles like a general. It calculated probabilities like a god. And its first decision was simple: let the enemy come closer. Meanwhile, the human civilians were not told the details. They weren't shown the weapons or told where the fleets were going. They were simply told to trust their leaders, to prepare for changes, and to stay calm. And they did. Because something deep in the human spirit had awakened a quiet old instinct from a world where survival had always come with a cost. Schools closed, but not in fear and focus. Children were taught survival skills, coding, and tactics. Factories shifted production from civilian tech to wartime essentials. Even artists and musicians began creating pieces that inspired courage rather than fear. It wasn't chaos. It was controlled transformation, a species turning itself into a single weapon, mind, body, and soul aligned. Outside Earth's orbit, old war relics were pulled from the grave. Ships that had been left drifting decades ago were towed into repair docks and given new life. But the most important project of all remained unseen even by most humans. Deep in the Orc cloud, in the cold silence of deep space, an object drifted cloaked, alone, and massive. It was the Storm, a human dreadnought unlike anything built before. It didn't just carry weapons, it carried silence. A silence that moved like a shadow, hiding its true nature. It wasn't listed in any database, and no civilian even knew it existed. It had been built in secret, with parts smuggled from every corner of human space, assembled by an AI that answered to no government. And now, it waited. Not for orders, but for the signal. As the Zorthan fleet approached the border systems, they found only empty space. Stations were abandoned, outposts powered down. It looked like the humans had fled. The Zorthans laughed, believing they had already won. They began spreading propaganda, claiming that Earth had gone dark out of fear. But deep inside their command ships, their analysts started seeing something strange: energy spikes that made no sense, random sensor echoes, and ships that appeared and vanished in the blink of an eye. By the time they realized it wasn't retreat, it was too late. The trap had already begun closing. Because while the galaxy had been watching the council chamber and listening to Elias Ward's words, Earth had moved in silence, like a hunter in the dark. And now, that hunter was ready. The stars above the Zorthan fleet shimmered with silence, calm and still, but it was the kind of silence that warned of a coming storm. The enemy armada, spread wide across the border sectors, looked strong and confident. Thousands of Zorthan warships hovered like a steel wall, their weapons charged, their commanders smug in their assumption that the humans had already lost. To them, Earth was a primitive world, emotional, disorganized, and weak compared to the cold efficiency of the galactic empires. But that illusion shattered the moment the first human ship appeared, not in front of them, but inside their own ranks. It came without warning, without any signal, like a ghost rising from the shadows of space. The ship was unlike anything the Zorthans had seen, black as the void, without visible engines, almost as if space itself had opened its eyes. The Zorthans didn't even have time to raise shields. In a single breath, a pulse wave erupted from the ship, not a beam or a missile, but a soundless blast of directed energy that bypassed armor and screens, targeting systems directly inside enemy ships. The result was chaos. 20 ships went dark, not exploded, but completely disabled, floating in silence with crews unable to even send distress calls. Panic spread before understanding. Commanders screamed orders, scanning space for the attacker, but by then, the human ghost ship had already vanished, as if it had never been there. At the same time, in a system light-years away, a hidden human base sent out a silent signal. From behind a cold moon, dozens of stealth bombers activated and began their run. They were fast, small, and deadly, slipping through enemy patrol routes without being seen. Each bomber carried something special, not just explosives, but smart weapons that adapted mid-flight, changing shape, changing target, always thinking. Within minutes, supply lines were cut. Refueling stations exploded from within. Communication relays fell silent. The Zorthan fleet, which had prepared for a glorious charge toward Earth, suddenly found itself confused, blind, and scattered. They had trained for a frontal war, not this. And then came the real strike. From behind Saturn's rings, Earth's main fleet emerged not in pieces, but as a wall. Ships of all sizes moved in perfect formation, not as individuals, but as parts of a single living machine. The dreadnought Hammerfall led the charge, its hull covered with adaptive armor and strange energy fields that shifted colors like liquid metal. It didn't fire first. Instead, it sent out a message to the Zorthan command ship, just one line: "This is your first and only warning." But the Zorthans, proud and arrogant, ignored it. They opened fire, unleashing a storm of plasma and missiles. The human ships didn't flinch. They didn't scatter or retreat. Instead, the Hammerfall absorbed the blasts through its energy lattice, then responded with a weapon no one had expected. A gravitational warhead was launched, not aimed at a ship, but at space itself. It created a sudden rift, bending gravity in a way that pulled enemy ships into one another. Without even touching them, it caused them to crash, spin, and shatter. Within seconds, 30 enemy vessels were gone. Every move the humans made was fast, efficient, and terrifyingly precise. They didn't fight like a species protecting their home. They fought like a species that had prepared for extinction and refused to accept it. The Zorthan commanders, now desperate, called for reinforcements, but nothing came. Their backup fleets had already been intercepted. Human strike teams had slipped into their communication arrays hours before, rewriting their codes, feeding them false signals. Some Zorthan ships tried to retreat, only to find that their own jump drives had been disabled by sabotage. The humans had been inside their systems long before the war had begun. And now, the Zorthans realized they were not fighting a chaotic world. They were fighting a shadow empire, silent, hidden, and deadly. On the battlefield, Elias Ward watched from the command deck of the Hammerfall. He didn't smile. He didn't cheer. His face was calm, focused, like a man fulfilling a promise made long ago. Around him, officers worked in silence, their movements fast but controlled. Every victory was a step in a carefully designed path. There was no celebration, only precision. Because this was not revenge. This was not anger. This was deterrence, and it had to be absolute. In one swift operation, Earth had destroyed over a third of the Zorthan invasion force without losing a single ship. Not because they were stronger. Even as the first strike ended, new threats were emerging. Other alien empires, watching from afar, had begun to realize that humans were not just defending, they were reshaping the rules of war. Some were terrified, others curious, but none could ignore what they had just witnessed. A species that had been considered soft, slow, and emotional had just executed the most flawless counterattack in modern galactic history. And yet, the humans didn't broadcast their victory. They didn't send messages or boast on the channels. They let the silence speak. That silence was more powerful than any speech, because it carried a message every species understood. If provoked, humanity would not just fight back, they would rewrite the entire battlefield. Back on Earth, the public didn't even know the full scale of what had just happened. News channels only said the first defense phase was successful. But underground, in command centers and hidden bunkers, the true story spread among the leaders and strategists. The first strike had been a test not just of weapons, but of unity. And it had worked. Humanity, fragmented and divided for centuries, had finally fought as one. No borders, no politics, only survival. And something deeper had changed too. The galaxy had just learned a lesson it would never forget. The humans were not to be measured by the size of their fleets or the age of their technology. They were to be measured by something else, something unseen until now. The ability to endure in silence, to prepare without panic, and when the moment came, to strike like lightning from a clear sky. But Elias Ward knew it wasn't the end. He looked at the star map on the screen, eyes fixed on new movements, distant signals, whispers of other powers beginning to stir. The Zorthans were only the beginning. The real war was still waiting, hidden in the stars, written in the silence that always followed the first strike. The galaxy had never been this quiet. Not even during the bloodiest wars or after the destruction of the twin stars of Seraph had such a heavy silence fallen across so many systems. Entire worlds paused. Military leaders held their breath. Traders stayed close to their home orbits. Pirate bands vanished into black holes they once used as shortcuts. No one could believe what they had seen or what they had failed to see. The Zorthan fleet, once considered untouchable, had not just lost, they had vanished, dismantled by a single unified strike from a species that had never been taken seriously. And now, from the edge of human territory, a signal had gone out. It wasn't just a declaration. It was a message, broadcast on every open channel in every major language in the known galaxy, aimed at every species, every government, every watching eye that had once considered Earth to be a minor footnote in galactic affairs. The message was not filled with threats, nor was it a celebration. It began with silence, a black screen, and a slow, deliberate voice. The face of Elias Ward appeared not in full military dress, but in a simple uniform with the Earth emblem behind him. His tone was steady, his eyes sharp but calm. And what he said changed the course of galactic history. He didn't talk about revenge, or power, or victory. He spoke about survival. He spoke about pain, how humans had watched other planets fall, how they had been underestimated, ignored, and manipulated. He spoke about unity, how, for the first time, all nations of Earth had stood together under one purpose, not to conquer, but to protect what was theirs. He didn't boast about the weapons, or the secret operations, or the victory over the Zorthans. Instead, he spoke about limits. He made it clear that Earth would not tolerate another invasion, another insult, another attack. But then, he did something no one expected. He offered peace. Not surrender, not submission, but true, equal peace. A proposal that would let all species share knowledge, trade freely, and explore space without fear. But that peace came with a condition. If you bring war to us, he said slowly, you will not find fear. You will find the full weight of humanity. Not because we want destruction, but because we have survived it. We don't run. We don't beg. And we don't forget. The message was short, just under 7 minutes. But when it ended, the silence that followed was heavier than before. On warships across the stars, captains replayed it again and again, searching for weakness in his words and finding none. On council worlds, alien leaders debated the meaning of the message, realizing that Earth had not just survived, they had changed. They were no longer a backwater world crawling toward the stars. They were now a power, not just in weapons, but in spirit. Some called the message dangerous. Others called it inspiring. But no one dismissed it. Across the galaxy, smaller species who had been hiding under the shadows of larger empires began to whisper the name of Earth with new respect. Resistance groups found hope in that message. Colonies that had long suffered under oppressive rulers played it in secret. And even in the darkest corners of the universe, criminal syndicates and mercenary fleets paused and considered, was it worth going near a planet that had just crushed a superpower without blinking? Meanwhile, deep beneath Earth's surface, inside the command center where the message had been transmitted, he didn't smile. He knew the message was a risk. It would scare some. It would anger others. But it would also stop the bloodshed, at least for now. Around him, generals and scientists monitored responses from across the galaxy. Some alien governments had already sent back messages of warning. Others had gone completely dark, unsure of what to say. But the most surprising response came from an unexpected source, a rogue AI empire known only as the Shaded Core. No one had spoken to them in decades. They had destroyed their creators long ago and vanished into a mechanical zone near the galactic edge. But after the human message, they replied with one word, understood. That one word sent shivers through every government listening. If even the Shaded Core had taken the humans seriously, then the galaxy truly had changed. Back on the front lines, where debris from the Zorthan fleet still floated silently, human ships began rescue operations, not just for their own people, but for surviving enemies. Injured Zorthan soldiers were pulled from broken vessels, treated with care, and given medical aid. It wasn't weakness. It was part of the message. Earth wasn't just powerful, they fought only when forced, but when they did, they fought with everything they had. And they didn't hate their enemies. They simply refused to bow. Many Zorthan survivors wept not just from pain, but from shame. They had believed in their empire. They had thought the humans were nothing. But now, being treated by the very people they came to destroy, they understood how wrong they had been. And slowly, a rumor began to spread among them not of defeat, but of a new way forward. Some even whispered that their empire might change, that maybe the age of fear was ending, and something new had begun. On Earth, life returned to normal. Cities lit up again. Children went back to school. The skies remained peaceful. But everything had changed. People now looked at the stars not with fear, but with quiet confidence. They knew the galaxy was watching. They knew more battles might come. But they also knew something deeper, something unbreakable. Humanity had found its place. Not as rulers. Not as victims. But as survivors who had chosen to stand. And that choice echoed across space, louder than any weapon. The message to the galaxy had been sent. But the real power of it was not in the words spoken, it was in the actions taken before and after. The strike, the silence, the mercy. Together, they told a story. A story that every species, every soldier, every leader now carried with them. From now on, whenever a war council gathered in a distant star system, they would remember the name of Elias Ward. Whenever an empire considered invading a weaker world, they would think of Earth. And whenever someone asked, what happens when you push a species too far, they would replay that message. Because the humans had answered, not just with words, but with history. They had written it in fire, silence, and steel. And the galaxy would never forget.